Some choices, they change everything. You don't see it coming. You don't plan for it. And yet, before you even realize what's happening, you're standing at the edge of something you can never take back. I never thought it would happen to me. I never thought I'd find myself here, staring at my own reflection, wondering when I stopped recognizing the person looking back at me. But here I am. And if I could go back, if I could undo it all, would I? You know, trust is supposed to be unshakable, especially in a family. It's supposed to be the one thing you never have to second guess. But the truth is, trust is fragile. And when it breaks, it doesn't shatter in an instant. No, it cracks slowly, quietly, so faintly that by the time you realize it's broken, you're already standing in the ruins, wondering how you got there. My younger brother, he came to me with a request. A simple request, at least. That's what I told myself. And maybe in another life, in another moment, I would have said no. Maybe I would have walked away. But I didn't. I agreed. I know what you're thinking. I do, because I've thought it too over and over again. How did I let it happen? How did I let things get that far? But life doesn't always give you clear lines. Sometimes it's just a blur of emotions and choices. And before you know it, you've crossed into a place you can't come back from. I'm not here to justify anything. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm just here to tell you the truth, the way it happened, the way it felt, and maybe, just maybe, someone out there understands. So tell me, what would you have done? You know, when people think of betrayal, they picture something loud, something violent, something dramatic. But the truth is, real betrayal starts in silence, in the quiet spaces of a life that's lost its warmth, in the nights that feel colder, not because of the weather, but because of the distance between two people who were once everything to each other. That was my life. Married, settled, comfortably at least. That's what I told myself. But comfort isn't the same as happiness. And love doesn't disappear all at once. It fades slowly, like a candle burning low, until one day you look around and you're sitting in the dark, wondering when the light went out. My husband, he wasn't a bad man. He wasn't cruel. He didn't cheat, at least. I don't think he did. He was just absent. Even when he was home, he wasn't really there. His mind was always somewhere else's job, his phone, the next thing he needed to do. And me? I was just another part of the furniture, something familiar, something expected. I tried. God, I tried. I told myself it was normal that all marriages go through rough patches, that love changes over time, that it wasn't his fault or mine. It was just life. But the truth was, I was lonely. So lonely that it felt like I was disappearing, piece by piece, every single day. And the worst part, he never even noticed. And then my brother moved in. He's younger than me by a few years, but in some ways, he's always felt older, wiser maybe, or just more alive. We weren't particularly close growing up, but we were family. And when he needed a place to stay, I didn't hesitate, because that's what you do for family, right? He had just gone through a rough breakup, the kind that shakes you, leaves you raw, unsure of yourself. He didn't talk about it much, but I could see it in his eyes, the weight of it, the sadness he was trying to hide. And in a strange way, I understood him, because I was carrying my own sadness too. The house was the same, but suddenly it felt different. He filled the empty spaces, not just physically, but in a way I hadn't realized I needed. He talked, merrily talked, asked me how I was, looked at me, not through me, not past me, but at me, like I mattered, like I was seen. At first, it felt nice, harmless, like the warmth of the sun on your face after a long, cold winter. I let myself enjoy it, because why wouldn't I? It wasn't wrong to feel human, was it? To feel alive? But then something shifted. It was small, subtle, a glance that lingered too long, a moment of silence that stretched, heavy with something unspoken, a touchlight, accidental, but enough to make me aware. A feeling I didn't want to name, but couldn't ignore. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into things, but deep down, I knew. I knew something had started, and once it starts, stopping it isn't as easy as you think. This is where it began. This is where the lines started to blur. And I wish I could say I stopped it before it went too far. But if I did, I wouldn't be telling you this story. It started with a conversation. Just a simple conversation. But isn't that how these things always begin? Not with some grand moment of betrayal, but with something small, something so ordinary that you don't realize until much later that it was the moment everything changed. It was late. Too late. The kind of late where the whole house feels like it's holding its breath, where the air is heavy and everything feels different. My husband was asleep in our bedroom. The television was on, but the sound was more of a presence than a distraction. I found him sitting in the dim glow of the kitchen, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him. His head was down, his fingers tracing slow circles against the wooden table. He looked tired, worn. Not just physically, but in a way that felt deeper, like whatever was weighing on him had been there for a long time. I hesitated in the doorway. I should have just gone to bed. I should have ignored whatever was pulling me toward him, but I didn't. I sat down instead. "You okay?" My voice barely broke the silence. He lifted his head, and when he looked at me, it wasn't the look of a little brother seeking guidance, seeking a sibling's comfort. No, it was something else, something raw, something I wasn't ready for. "I need you to do something for me." His voice was quiet, steady, but there was an edge to it, something fragile underneath, like he was afraid of my answer before I even gave one. I frowned. What kind of request starts like that? He exhaled, shaking his head, like he was trying to work up the courage to say the words out loud. And then, finally, he said it. "Just once. I just need you to do something for me. I know it sounds crazy, but I don't have anyone else to ask." I laughed, but it came out forced, uneasy. That's a hell of a way to ask for a favor. I know. He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Something in his voice, I don't know how to explain it, but it made my stomach tighten, like I was standing too close to the edge of something I didn't understand yet. I searched his face, trying to figure out what he wasn't saying, trying to decide if I really wanted to know. "What is it?" I finally asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his glass, took a slow sip, and when he put it down, his hands were shaking just slightly. I don't know. I just need to feel something real again. The words hit me in a way I didn't expect. Maybe because I understood them too well. Maybe because deep down I had been feeling the same thing for so long, and I just never said it out loud. But he did. And suddenly, I wasn't looking at my younger brother anymore. I was looking at a man who was hurting, a man who needed something. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just seeing his pain. I was feeling it. This is wrong, I thought. But is it? I mean, we were just talking, that's all. Just two people sitting in a dimly lit kitchen in the middle of the night, having a conversation. People talk all the time. There was nothing wrong with that, right? Then why did my stomach feel tight? Why was my breath coming slower, deeper, like I was bracing for something I couldn't name? I should have ended it there. I should have laughed it off, told him to go to bed, stood up and walked away. But I didn't. Instead, I just sat there, gripping the edge of the table, trying to ignore the way my skin felt too warm, too aware. Trying to ignore the way his eyes, those familiar eyes I had known all my life, suddenly felt like something new, something dangerous. "I know that sounds weird," he said, running a hand over his face, exhaling like he was trying to shake something off. "Forget I said anything. I don't know. Lately, I feel like I don't belong anywhere, like I could disappear and no one would even notice." I opened my mouth to tell him that wasn't true, that of course he mattered, but the words caught in my throat because I understood it too well, that feeling of being invisible, of existing in a space where you're supposed to be loved but feeling like a ghost instead. So instead I just said, "I get it." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I think that was the moment everything started unraveling. I told myself I was just being kind, just listening, just being there for him. That's what family does, right? We support each other, we lift each other up when we're feeling low. But then, why did it feel like something else? Something heavier? Something that made my pulse quicken, my palms feel damp against the cool surface of the table. Why did it feel like I was standing at the edge of a very steep drop? I could hear my husband snoring down the hall. The sound of it used to be comforting once upon a time, a reminder that I wasn't alone. But now it just felt like a wall, like proof of how far apart we'd drifted. I thought about the way he barely looked at me anymore. The way he spoke to me out of habit, not affection. The way his touch, when it came, was routine, expected, hollow. And then I thought about the way my brother had looked at me just now, the way his voice had softened when he said he felt lost, the way, for the first time in so long, I felt like someone actually saw me. Not just as a wife, not just as a woman doing her duties, but as a person who mattered. "You should get some rest," I said finally, standing up, trying to shake off the heaviness pressing against my ribs. "You'll feel better in the morning." He nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't name, something that made my breath hitch in my throat. "Yeah?" he murmured. "Maybe." I turned to leave, forcing myself to move, to walk away before I said something I couldn't take back. But then, "Hey," he called softly. I stopped, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. "Thanks for listening." I nodded, kept my voice steady. Normal, casual. Of course, that's what family's for, right? Silence. And then, just as I was about to step out of the room, "Is it?" I didn't answer. I just walked away. But that one question, those two simple words stayed with me, long after I climbed into bed beside my sleeping husband, long after I closed my eyes and tried to pretend my heart wasn't beating too fast, long after I told myself, over and over again, that I had done nothing wrong, nothing at all. I told myself it was nothing that night in the kitchen, just a conversation, a moment of weakness between two people who had lost their way. It didn't mean anything, it wasn't dangerous. And yet, things started to change. Not in the obvious ways. No, the changes were small, barely noticeable. A shift in energy, a moment that stretched just a little too long, a glance that lingered when it should have passed unnoticed. I became hyper-aware of him, the way he moved around the house, the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the way his presence seemed to fill every room in a way it never had before. I started to anticipate him, to wonder if he would be in the kitchen when I went to make coffee, to listen for the sound of his voice, his footsteps, his laughter. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't something I was trying to do. It just happened. And then there were the touches. Accidental at first, completely innocent, brushing past each other in the hallway, fingers grazing when passing a plate at dinner. A hand on my lower back as he moved behind me, light as a whisper, but enough to send something warm crawling up my spine. None of it should have mattered, none of it should have meant anything, but it did. Then, one night, it changed. I had been reading in the living room, curled up in my usual spot on the couch, trying to lose myself in words that suddenly felt empty. He walked in, fresh out of the shower, his hair still damp, wearing an old t-shirt and sweats that clung just enough to remind me that he wasn't a boy anymore. I should have looked away, but I didn't. He sat down beside me. Too close, not inappropriate, not obvious, just close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, even with the space between us. "You look tired," he murmured after a while, his voice softer than usual. I swallowed. "Long day." He nodded, then hesitated, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Can I ask you for something?" Something in my stomach twisted, a warning, a line I knew I shouldn't cross. "What?" My voice came out quieter than I intended. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out slow and deliberate and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. The touch was featherlight, barely anything. And yet, it felt like everything. "A hug," he said finally. "That's all. Just a hug." I should have said no. I should have laughed it off, thrown a pillow at him, made some joke about him being too old for that kind of thing. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded. And before I could rethink it, before I could stop myself, he pulled me into his arms. At first, it felt normal, familiar. But then, something changed. His arms tightened around me just slightly, his breath fanned against my neck. His fingers pressed into my back, not enough to hurt, but enough to make my pulse spike. And the worst part? I let him. I closed my eyes, and for just a second, just one, I let myself sink into it, into the warmth of him, into the feeling of being held, really held, for the first time in what felt like forever. I don't know how long we stayed like that. It could have been seconds. It could have been minutes. All I know is that when I finally pulled away, my hands were shaking. His eyes met mine. There was something in them, something dark, something I wasn't ready to face. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice rough. It's okay." I cut him off too quickly, too desperate to pretend it hadn't meant anything. "I should. I gestured vaguely, standing up, needing distance, needing space to breathe. He nodded, but he didn't move, and neither did the feeling between us. That was the night I stopped lying to myself. That was the night I knew this wasn't nothing. And the worst part? I didn't want it to be.